Well, good afternoon, everybody. For me, it's a Sunday, very sunny, going to be like 30 degrees today. How exciting. And here I am today going to discuss more on fairy tales and the little story of Hansel and Gretel. Now, Hansel and Gretel is one of these little fairy tales that has been told time and time again. I looked it up today, translated in over 100 languages, and really is a child's favorite. But really, I have to say, there were messages in Hansel and Gretel that have to really do with family systems, structural systems in poverty and plague, abandonment, etc., step parentage, people that enter into relationships with an outside party who might have a much different vision for themselves other than taking care of somebody else's children. You know, the story of Hansel and Gretel, which you will read or will have read, as I noted in the syllabus, is really a story about the plague. It's a story that has been told over and over again in many countries in their societal family structure. But I'm going to talk specifically today about poignant connections that I make with this story, which goes back to why we keep asking, what is the purpose of literature? Why do we keep telling these stories? How do these stories replicate life? You know, how we say art can be found in life, life can be found in art. Certainly so. You know, with Hansel and Gretel, they have this stepmother. I'm just going to summarize. They have this stepmother who, in the middle of this plague, tells their father, you got to put them in the woods. We don't have any money to feed them. And that's what he does. He abandons them in the woods. Now, in the last lecture cast, I talked about the woods. I didn't think I was going to be talking about the woods some more today. But again, this idea of taking two very vulnerable people, little children, putting them in the woods, fending for themselves, being rejected. We don't have any money to feed you. We don't want you here. We won't fend for you. So we'll really cast you into this darkness. We will put you back into the woods. You know, in the last lecture cast, in my little coffee table series, I talked about the unknown, the forest, though we've seen it before. There were different nuances that we're not sure of, etc. And so again, putting two vulnerable people in. Now, do I think that this story serves a moral purpose? I do. I think that the point of this fairy tale at the time, and remember, I'm not right or wrong, this is just my opinion, not only served as a form of entertainment, because of course people didn't have television, they didn't have, you know, all kinds of platforms for social media, no radio, etc. So I think the days were very long. So with the with the moral of the story, in addition to entertainment, I think the idea that, you know, parentage and caretaking could be easily done by somebody else, and that children often find themselves at the mercy of whether somebody elects to be their parent or not. Children find themselves at the mercy of whether their biological parent caregiver succumbs to somebody else's whims, if they can live with them, if they can't live with them. You know, in contemporary model, I think about Hansel and Gretel all the time. Do I think I would read this little fairy tale? So horrible. To children that are in foster care, adoptive care. Well, no, they're already living it. So many children in New York State. I'm an expert on this. I really feel I can speak about this subject as it relates to literature, as it relates to family science, criminal law, family law, etc. So many children find themselves sometimes in the care of people that they don't even know. They find themselves in the care of what New York State calls a relative resource. Relative resource is a person or persons that are related by blood, not by marriage, by blood, that elect to take somebody into their home in the event that their biological and or adoptive natural, or they call it unnatural, which I think is ridiculous, but unnatural parentage is unable to care for them. So that person can become a relative resource. In New York State, very often that closes the door to having relationships with natural parentage. New York State law used to be sort of open-ended that the parents could come back really at any given time and reclaim their children from relative resource. The laws have recently changed in the last 5 years with you have 3 years to reclaim your children because children just can't be flung out into the forest wondering who will care for them, etc. There comes a point towards the third year that New York State court starts to ask the biological parents and or natural caregivers, do you want to be a parent? Are you prepared to be a parent? Are you prepared to feed these people? Clearly, I have this picture. I love candy. I just don't eat it very often. And if I do, it's sugar free. I love candy, you know. I love this idea of plentiful candy. I love to see candy. I love to taste candy when I was eating candy, etc. But this idea that food as a resource, food as a source, is not only a life and death issue, but it can also bring so much joy. You know, very often in foster care. At one time in my life, actually it was more than once, 2 times in my life, I was foster care child myself. So this idea that you have access to plentiful food, that you're not going to be penalized if you ask for food, if you're afraid to ask for food. I see the purpose of so many of these fairy tales. Uh, they really select sometimes aspects of a really real life of what's going on at the time. And then I'm thinking that maybe children back then, their form of pop art, you know, or current literature, they would read these little tales and then they would say, oh, how fortunate I am that I'm not Hansel and Gretel. Maybe similarly, uh, let's say when I was younger, if I didn't finish everything on my plate, maybe my parents and or a caregiver or school personnel would say, oh, there are all these starving children at this other location, and you should be so thrilled that that isn't you, and therefore shame you into eating more on your plate. Now, maybe that was some of the purpose in having these kinds of stories. Maybe these kinds of stories also were a large part of culture. Maybe because we didn't have family law, criminal justice, we didn't have the idea of relative resource, non-relative resource, family supports, community supports, and that maybe the bottom line is that many children across Europe during plagues, etc., found themselves houseless as well as homeless, with very little to eat, if anything, and really, left to their own accord. I think often about this particular fairy tale and others. At one time in my career, I worked with children that interface with the juvenile justice system. And it really broke my heart. On Sundays, there's a place here, not far from RIT. I reference it in most of the classes I teach because I find it a very baffling place. It's called the State School and Industry, and it's all male persons that were born as men, not that identify as men. They don't have that kind of um, opportunity for people to be sentenced in that way. It's just biologically male, regardless of how they see themselves and their sexuality relatable to another gender. So Sundays used to be the traditional visiting day, and I can tell you the parking lot was very empty. And it sort of meant that parents would either lose their children to the criminal justice system based on things the child had done, and or sometimes the criminal justice system in many ways was the only place to put many persons that were hard to place, that didn't have relative resource and or community resource or non-relative resource. It's very hard for many families to manage their own family system, let alone take somebody else that maybe they don't know at all. They don't know the family system. They're unaware of the mandatory visits. that might occur, medical, dental appointments, etc., and become foster parent, foster family. So I think of this story, Hansel and Gretel. Why is literature important? Well, because we're telling the same story really for hundreds of years, thousands of years, you know. Why is it important to have this kind of conversation? Because as much as things change in many ways, technology, function of technology, medicine, aerospace, etc., some of these very human situations don't change. I think often about the children that are from Somali. I have somebody in my life that I work with that's from Somali, and I think about him often. He came here to Rochester because he had no relative resource at 6 years old. So he came through an agency from Somali to here because in Somalia at the time, 20 some odd years ago, they really were beginning a civil war. And he found himself really alone. Can you imagine being alone at 6 years old? Really, in his case, not flung into the forest, but flung into the desert. And part of the war, civil war in Somalia, has a lot to do with who will have the water, who will drink the water, who will be near the water, who will pay for water, who won't pay for water. It's really centralized around water. And so he came here, and we joke often that he really doesn't know his real birth date because his father had passed away in this drought, and his mother had had over a dozen children and wasn't well herself, was suffering from dysentery and a myriad of other things because the little water that there was wasn't treated appropriately. You know, all these things we stem from really our discussion about a fairy tale, all these political, socio-political, eco-political issues, you know. And needless to say, she couldn't care for all of her children. She was sick herself. So he wound up coming here to Rochester, and he jokes that he really doesn't know his birthday. He has some idea when his birthday is. He has some sense of how old he is based on dental work and other, recoverable anecdotes of when he was born, when that could have been birth order, series of birth order. Anyway, the agency that brought him over for his immigration status decided his birthday was January 1. Whether it is, it isn't, it doesn't matter. They decided. You know, I think about these kinds of things. I think often in the Sudan, the walking boys, all these boys that walked for 10, 15 years across the Sudan without any parental supports, that without any food, clothing, water, shelter, medicine, just really at the mercy of whoever could give them something along the way. Very important discussions that really stem from just our little discussion of Hansel and Gretel, a very quick read. It ends nicely, it ends happily. The stepmother dies. Good for us, right? We have a victory, and the father is happy to see them again. But I think to myself, when I think about the ending, I think to myself, it's sort of a domestic violence situation in my interpretation, that the father either allows himself to be manipulated or he goes along with it and flings his children into the wilderness. We see this often, very often here in Rochester. I see this as well when I see especially single mother households, not so much with fathers, but single mother households where the mother might be on drugs, using drugs recreationally. They could be illegal and or legal drugs, doesn't matter. The end result is they're using, and they wind up in a relationship either with a man or a woman or non-binary, it doesn't matter. We could say another person. They wind up in a relationship where that other person is the person who has the goods. They have the drugs. Therefore, the person who has the drugs makes the rules. And very often you see, I hate this word, we see very often the using mother will surrender. I hate that word, but that's the word we use in New York State legally, that they will surrender the children to foster care and or alternative living situation, which we do have orphanage-like housing here. We have hard to place children that don't go to traditional foster care methods because either they have too many health issues or they have too much trauma. Wouldn't it be interesting to write an article about Hansel and Gretel and trauma, childhood trauma, abandonment, foster care, and adoptive care and reunification care, you know, with children and parentage, as seen in Hansel and Gretel. I don't know too many cases in the real world of Hansel and Gretel's that go back that seem so overjoyed to be back. Usually it's fraught with a lot of mixed feelings, you know. This I call it the push-pull syndrome. You can stay, you can go. I want you, I don't want you. I have food, I don't have food. I'm busy with my drug use. You can't come back now. This whole push-pull thing, it really does a number on kids, and it usually doesn't end happily ever after. There's an aspect too of Hansel and Gretel, I think to myself, if you're only if you're only pretty, if you're only handsome, if you're only polite, then you luck out and somebody will take you. There's this aspect of humanity in our country. I know we have it in New York State, where we do have online through the Office of Family and Children's Services, they do post pictures, which really bothers me. They post pictures of children that are available for adoption on the New York State site. So it's like a catalog. They tell you things about the kids, what they like, what they don't like, what their favorite things are to do. It's like a sales pitch. There are also these meet and greets across the country. Different states have that many children, Hansel and Gretelish, that have been exited from family systems, food systems, natural support systems, housing, clothing, etc., emotional care, right? Part of being parent caregivers to provide emotional care, to be present, where the children have been ushered out of the house and they have these sort of meet and greets where the kids are told, you know, if you look presentable, if you keep smiling, if you seem nice, maybe people will be drawn to you and they'll take you home. It's like a puppy show. It's really bothersome, but there are so many children that are in foster care and out of home care that I guess, I mean, I have to be honest, in defense of many states and including New York, I guess there are just so many unplaceable children that we have to fix them up, I suppose, and have them put their best foot forward, like an interview, and hope somebody takes them. It's really not the ideal scenario to say to a youthful person underage, gee, if you can be all these things, then maybe somebody will love you, somebody will like you, somebody will care for you, somebody will take you home. It seems to me that that's an awful lot of bidding, an awful lot of performative lifestyle to get somebody to like you enough to say, well, you're good enough, I'll bring you home. Very troublesome. You know, it's a hard business. So I look at the purpose of why are we retelling all these stories? You know, I look at Hansel Gretel, very contemporary story, very truthful story, what happens to people, especially children, who are very vulnerable and get kicked out. Or in some cases, similar to mine, a parent passes away, so you really can't blame the parent. I know you can't argue with somebody from the grave. I mean, they get sick, they die, and or the other parent just doesn't feel equipped or they become ill too, you know, and they can't be a caretaker or they don't wish to. You know, they even if you have a deep level of understanding how this story of Hansel and Gretel translates to today's culture and family systems, family science, etc., it still isn't good enough. It's still, even to say, even for myself to say, oh, well, I can understand the merit of situations that people find themselves in, and this is why this happens. Even though I have all the understanding, compassion in the world, obviously, I'm saying to you that it still isn't good enough. It still isn't good enough to say to a child, gee, this home that you knew for a good deal of your life, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, maybe 13, 14, 15 years, all the holidays that you knew, whatever it was that you knew, all of a sudden you're not going to have it anymore. And you might get an answer why, you might not get an answer why. You might not ever come back. You might not really still even be clear into adulthood why this has happened. You might have, uh, 4 questions, you get 5 answers. You know, that's the worst scenario when you have many questions and the answers, none of them link up, but you get a continuous barrage of answers that just really they're irrelevant. They don't make any sense. Or we see parents that have clearly moved on, you know. I've seen that also in case management, casework. You see parents that have surrendered their children for whatever reason, and 5, 10 years later, they have a whole new family, whole new established family. Before the advent of computers, before the ability to see so much online, many adoptees really didn't know many of their circumstances that were flung out into the world for whatever reason. And then technology made it so many people are able to be reunified with the truth. Maybe not so much their parent, biological, natural parent, natural support. And then the other question beckons in contemporary scenario, which I'll leave you with today, is why didn't the rest of the family step up? Why, it's so few people that really have nobody. Again, this idea, metaphor, alone in the forest. Most people have people. They have a community. They have schools in which they went. They have friends, parents that watch them get ushered out of the home. So when people say, well, they really had nobody, what happened to all the natural supports that were in the town, the village, the community? Are we really saying that people just turned their back and didn't want to be bothered? I think that is what we're saying. I do. I think back again about that place I told you about near RIT at Industry. Now they have different visiting hours because we've had a little bit of reform, prison and jail reform, especially as it relates to juvenile justice. Now they've opened here at Industry, another place called Highland. It's spelled Highland, but it's pronounced Highland. That's in Westchester County down by Hudson Valley. And now they have weekday appointments when people can come visit their kids that are incarcerated. Uh, and the unfortunate thing is though we've raised and expanded all these hours, the truth of the matter is that these visiting rooms are just not brimming with visitors. I don't know why we came to a place in our society. Here's a question I ask myself. Why is it we came to a place in society that we felt people could be disposable? So it's not only Hansel and Gretel, it's not only children that are hard to care for, impoverished, poverty, it's at war, health, sickness. But if we expand that to the elderly, there are so many elderly that, reach their age of majority, 62, 63, 64, 65, and they get put into assisted living. They get put into housing. You mean to tell me that grandma, grandpa, great grandma, great grandpa, that old saying, you might not know it, you'll know it now. We say grandma can take care of 10 children, but 10 children can't take care of grandma. So we see so many of the elderly that are just tucked away, packed away often before their time. They're sort of extracted from society, put away in some kind of housing. Maybe they could have stayed independent in their natural environment if they had a few supports, but, it was just easier to put them away. When you travel to some other countries and you say the word nursing home, I know this is hard to believe. In many other countries, there's really no translation because other countries don't have nursing home. People value elders, they value children as well that could maybe be difficult to care for or hard to care for, or people have to make financial sacrifice, or like my little picture that I attached, a little less candy for everybody so somebody else can have a couple pieces, that idea of sharing, I'll have less on my plate so somebody else can have it. But again, this idea of this disposable kind of person, that they weren't important enough or they were too hard to love or just nobody wanted them. That's a very, very hard territory to have to negotiate for the rest of your life when you say, oh, I had cousins, I had aunts, I had other people, Hansel and Gretel, that story, all these Hansel and Gretels, for whatever reason, old and young, flung into the forest. Where was everybody else? Or were they busy eating the extra nuts, the extra candies, the extra figs? And they said, well, triumph over tragedy. People make it out all the time. But I say at what cost? So I will leave you with those thoughts, the purpose of retelling these stories, and actually Hansel and Gretel becomes purposeful because it springboarded me I hope you might share the same idea, not necessarily my opinions, but it springboarded us to have this conversation about the realities of family systems, the realities, psychodynamic realities in family structure, who stays, who goes, who survives, who doesn't, how people survive, this idea of reconciliation, you know. Hard pill to swallow, reconciliation. Can you imagine if we had a part two of Hansel and Gretel? Where would they be today? Exactly what would go on in reality television, as we know at these platforms, where people are reconciled and they say, I have so much anger, I have so much resentment because you flung me into the metaphor forest and left me with nobody. And then if it wasn't for the death of, in this case, this wicked step parent, then I wouldn't be able to come back. We see this story over and over again in so many aspects of our culture. Anyhow, my dears, I hope you move on with a wonderful day. Always be willing to have kindness come your way. People want to do something nice for you. It's so wonderful. Just say thank you. It's terrific. Kindness, you can never not have too much of it. I've never heard of anybody overdosing from education. They say, oh, I have too much education in my life. It's ruined my life. Or people say, I have too much kindness in my life. It's ruined my life. It's good. It's a good thing. Okay, well, you be blessed and always enjoy. Bye-bye.